Hi, I'm Colin.
And I'm Phil.
We're the hosts of Science Fiction 101.
It's a show which gets to the heart of science fiction. Books, films, TV. We've covered Star Trek,
Doctor Who,
Star Wars.
We love to explore the past, present, and future of science fiction.
And we'd love for you to join us
on Science Fiction 101.
Hi, Colin.
Hi, Phil.
Today we're going to look at John Wyndham, the British author of classics such as The Day of the Triffids. Have you been on a Wyndham binge, Colin?
I have. I read 3 different John Wyndham books. One was a review. One I can actually consider advanced research for future podcasting episodes. And the last one I just kind of pulled out of thin air from his earlier works.
Ah, interesting. We'll find out which ones you've been reading in a moment. I've also been on a binge, and I was delighted to discover that his books are mostly very short. When I downloaded the audiobook version of a couple of them, they're like 4 hours, 3 hours 15. Wow, what a short story writer he was, really, but in the form of novels. Anyway, we'll get to the detail on that shortly. First, just a quick acknowledgement for all the comments we've received on our last few episodes, the two episodes with Robert J. Sawyer and the bonus episode on film festivals. We heard from Sue, who was quite amazed that the OMSI Film Festival that we were talking about was on for 8 weeks. Mm-hmm. And she said, I envision logistical problems like paying staff, security, having enough films, sustaining interest, getting enough time at a given theatre, etc. And in that same discussion, we spoke about movies being delivered to a cinema as a DCP, a digital cinema package. And I think it was Andy who asked how that process works, which is a great question. And from my own experience of working with DCPs, I know that traditionally they're delivered on hard drives containing maybe 100 to 200 gigabytes of data, but they can also be delivered as secure downloads. So in the cinema, they're ingested into the projection system and then played from there. You can't, as a mere mortal like us, you can't take a DCP and play it on your computer. Well, you can with special software, but it's not easy to get your hands on, and it's very expensive. So it's not something you're going to use at home, I don't think. Joe wrote to try to clarify something in one of our quizzes. I think, Colin, you gave me a Star Trek question, which was what was Captain Kirk's middle name, or when did we find out what his middle name was, or something like that. And I can't remember what the answer was. I mean, I know it was Tiberius, but I can't remember where the name was revealed. But Joe says it wasn't revealed in the original series, and it wasn't revealed for the first time in the Star Trek movies. It was revealed for the first time in the animated series. So I'm going to trust Joe on that. I haven't fact-checked, but I think he's right. Emmanuel wrote, I enjoyed Rob Sawyer's anecdotes a lot, and I agree with him that Canada rocks. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he?
He would. He's biased.
Emmanuel also points out that Montreal is bidding to host the 2027 Worldcon. They're waiting in line behind... Where is it next year, Colin? I mean, this year it's in Scotland. Next year, where is it?
Seattle, I believe.
Seattle, that's it. And then, where is it in 26? Are you typing it in? I
tried very quickly, but what I'm getting are... realtor answers. 2026 Hugo Avenue, Charleston, South Carolina.
That sounds good. It's probably a very small house, and 50,000 people will now turn up thinking it's the Worldcon.
Los Angeles in 2026, it looks like.
Ah, okay.
And there's a 2028 Uganda bid.
Oh, wow. Anyway, keep the comments coming, folks. You can either comment on Facebook, where you'll find us as Science Fiction 101 Podcast, or on our blog, which is at 101sf.blogspot.com. So, John Wyndham, or to give him his full name, John Wyndham Parks Lucas Bainan Harris. Where shall we begin with John Wyndham, Colin?
I am actually really curious. So John Wyndham is thought of as one of the best science fiction authors to come out of England. Did you come across his works when you were in school?
Yeah. I first came across his works on TV because the 1961 film version of Day of the Triffids was always on TV when I was a child. Oh, and also the films of the Midwich Cuckoos were also always on TV when I was a kid. So I saw those. And I think the first time I ever actually read a book of his would have been probably in the late 70s when they were there in school. Not in a class, but just in the library. And I thought, I know these stories from the films. I better read these books. So I did. Yeah. I don't know if he's as well known today, but because they still keep doing TV versions of Triffids and the Midwich Cuckoos, and coming up next year is The Trouble with Lichen or Lichen. He's always been there.
So that's coming out next year?
I think so.
Wow. And is that going to be a movie or a miniseries or a television series?
I believe it's a TV miniseries.
Interesting. I will note that for perhaps a different podcast that I also sit on.
Yeah.
Yeah. We haven't done a lot of miniseries, but we did dip our toes into the water with Percy Jackson.
Okay, yeah. I think the thing with John Wyndham is, in the UK, from the 1950s onwards, he was an author who was published in hardcover, so he was seen as a serious novelist. And in fact, his publishers weren't pushing him as a science fiction writer. I mean, it was obvious to everyone who read the books that they were science fiction, but he wasn't being pushed as a science fiction writer. He was being pushed as a writer. And I think, therefore, he had a kind of a respectability and a presence in bookshops that other science fiction writers just didn't get. You know, most science fiction writers were treated very much as genre authors, but he was very much promoted as just a novelist.
Well, even though he was writing science fiction, a lot of the science fiction that I think, well, at least here in the States, that he's best known for, they're not so far out as science fiction.
Yeah.
The Day of the Triffids could almost be called, it's near-term science fiction, but there's no aliens, there's no space empires, there's no lasers. It's these creations that we made got out of hand, and then a random event that we might be responsible for caused everyone to go blind, and then it all goes south from there.
And in that respect, he's similar, I think, to somebody like Michael Crichton. Crichton also wrote things that were science fiction, but they were presented often in the form of a techno-thriller, very much set in our current world where something goes wrong, and usually it goes wrong because of human error or human arrogance or something like that. So I think Crichton is probably the closest analogue I can think of to John Wyndham, although I think Wyndham's style is perhaps a little bit more like H.G. Wells. He reads as quintessentially British, just as Wells does. I don't know whether to you he reads as British, or whether his novels just feel more, I don't know, just generic 20th century.
So I first read Day of the Triffids back in 2014 for Take Me to Your Reader, my other podcast. And we had been doing a lot. I think that was year one. We had started the podcast. It was great prose.
Yeah.
It was well written. It was enjoyable to read. It had flow and style. Whether it was science fiction or not, it was just a great read. And that does not always happen in science fiction.
Yeah.
And I would say his prose is way better than Crichton's.
I've never thought to compare their sort of sentence level style. I've only ever thought to compare the types of stories that they tell and the causes behind the stories, But yeah, I suppose Wyndham reads as a bit more of a stylist than Crichton does. Shall we go through the books, shall we say the main books that Wyndham did, and certainly any that we've read in the last few weeks, and just say a few words about each one?
Sure.
The books you've been reading recently, are you aware of which is the earliest?
Well, I had read in his Wikipedia entry that his writing changed dramatically after World War II.
Yeah.
So at that point, I had already read Day of the Triffids and the Midwich Cuckoos. And so I wanted to read one of his earlier works. And so I picked up and got from my library Stowaway to Mars, 1936.
Yeah.
It was released in 2 chunks, and then there's a fix-up novel which takes the 2 halves and brings them together.
Okay. Now, I don't think I've ever read that one. I have read some of Wyndham's early short stories, and as you say, he was writing before the Second World War, and I've mentioned this before on the podcast. He was one of the very few British writers to crack the American pulp magazine market. So he made a living from writing for American magazines. A very unusual thing.
Yeah.
And when he was doing this, he was writing under the name of John Bainham Harris, which is his real name, or part of his real name, or John Bainham. And I think he occasionally called himself Lucas Parks, which is another 2 of his 5 or 6 names. But yeah, after World War II, he sort of relaunched himself by adopting this new identity, John Wyndham. And I think his writing style changed dramatically from being American, about space and rockets and short stories, to being this cool, calm British novelist of very earthbound disaster stories.
Mm-hmm. And really, I think that's why we know him.
Absolutely. What did you think of the Stowaway story?
It was a remarkably different experience from reading his later works. Now, granted, there's 15 years of time in a war in the middle, and people are allowed to grow and change.
Sure.
It reminded me a lot of pulp reading from the time.
Yeah.
I had read someplace that Wyndham was considered a bit of a feminist for the time. And Stowaway to Mars definitely does not fall into that category. There's a long screed about what's wrong with women and how they don't want to understand how things work. And at first I took it as, this is just, a character ranting, because there was some character ranting about the stowaway who was a lady.
Yeah.
But later on, the lady gets captured by somebody from Mars, and they're trying to explain the basics of their technology. And she's like, oh, I know this is interesting, and I'm kind of a scientist, but I really just don't care about learning about how it works, which brought it full circle. And I was amazed. It's like, wow.
I mean, my impression is he must very much have been writing to the style of the magazines. He was a reader of those magazines. He knew what they expected, and he provided them with those kind of stories. But you're absolutely right. He did have a very strong feminist streak, and this was not only in his works. You'll see it in Day of the Triffids. You'll see it in the Midwich Cuckoos. It's not only there in the works, it's there in his life. He had a lifelong partner who, I don't think they actually lived together, but they lived in adjacent apartments, and they were very much an item. But in Britain at the time, we're talking here about the 1940s and the 1950s and onwards, apparently, now I didn't know this, but apparently, if you worked for the government or local government, or sort of any public body, like the BBC, for instance. And if you were a woman, if you got married, you had to give up your job. It wasn't a choice that women had. It wasn't that, I'm getting married, I am now going to leave work and have children. It wasn't that. It was that they were required to resign.
Wow.
And when I read that, this can't be true. But I've looked it up in various places, and it does seem to have been very much standard practice in those times. And Wyndham was totally against this, and that was one of the reasons he gave for not marrying this lifelong partner. They did marry when she retired, but yeah, so he had this very strong view that women were being devalued by this requirement. I think that in itself makes him a very different writer. But once we get to 1951, we get The Day of the Triffids. It's his first post-war novel, and I was very interested to learn from a book called Hidden Wyndham, which is a biography of Wyndham, that he wrote Day of the Triffids around 1948, just having completed his sort of wartime service. And he was shopping it around, trying to sell it. And the first version of it had Triffids that came from Venus. They were seeds that were brought back from Venus. So he was writing, I suppose, in the John Bain Harris style. You know, he was writing something that might have been a bit more modern as a novel, but was still using those science fiction tropes of spaceships. And the person who was instrumental in getting it to be the novel we know today was Frederick Pohl. Fred Pohl, some listeners will know, was an award-winning writer. He wrote Gateway and Gem and Man Plus and various others. He was not only a writer, he was a publisher's editor, he was a magazine editor, and he was an agent. And he was John Wyndham's agent.
Oh.
So he was instrumental in getting Day of the Triffids sold in the US. And he also sold it to Collier's magazine to be serialized. And apparently the Collier's version still has the reference to the Triffids being from Venus. But the book versions don't have that. He made it much more of a Cold War mystery angle. You know, who has created these Triffids? Sort of a mystery at the heart of the story, which is never completely revealed in the book. But originally, they were from Venus.
Amazing. You know, I also read that the Americanized version of Day of the Triffids is shorter than the British version.
Yeah, so I understand.
Yeah, so now when I come to visit, I want a copy. Because one of the downsides of ebooks is you're limited to your distributor for the most part. And I cannot find out how to get a UK ebook of Day of the Triffids.
Right, yeah.
There's a website that's dedicated to that. That lines out all the differences and has some John Wyndham trivia and history and something that I'll mention when we do past, present, and future. And
interesting. Another fascinating little fact. When Day of the Triffids was sold to Collier's magazine, Wyndham earned $12,500. Don't know if that means much to you. I mean, to me, it still sounds like a very large sum of money. Thank you very much. I'd love to be handed $12,000.
Oh, yeah.
In today's money, that's $150,000. That's a huge sum of money for a book.
That is quite the advance, yeah.
For a book that's just about to come out in hardcover, and this is just what he's being paid for it to be serialized. On top of that, he had the two publishing deals, the UK deal and the American deal. So, yeah, he was making some very big money compared to what he must have been earning as a pulp writer, where you're paid by the word and you're not paid very much.
Yeah.
So you can see how this transformed his life. And I've got one more fascinating thing from this book about Wyndham by Amy Binns. She wrote the book by researching in the Wyndham archive, which is held at the University of Liverpool. Here's a quote. This is from a letter that Wyndham wrote to Fred Pohl. He wrote, "John Wyndham is not cluttered up with memories of early wonder stories. John Bain has no value as a name. In fact, I'd say the opposite. I strongly suspect that he is regarded by any science fiction readers who have heard of him as one of the old back numbers. So, if you are agreeable, we will adopt John Wyndham and stick to it." So he made a very conscious effort to change his identity at this point in time. And it was definitely an attempt to shake off any baggage that he might be carrying as a former pulp writer. And it seems to have paid off.
That's interesting that his papers, it must be papers about him. There's a YouTube documentary about him from 2008, I think.
Yeah.
And it says that upon his death, he requested that all of his private papers be destroyed and burned. And that was honored.
Yeah.
So it's probably a challenge to find information about him. You know, his version, like, that must be a letter from Fred Pohl, because his copy of it would be gone.
That is probably the case, yeah. I can't remember the provenance of that particular letter, but I gather that these are mostly letters that his copy, if there even was a copy at his end, his copy is gone, but the recipient's copy still exists, yeah. As I say, he did get married in the last few years of Wyndham's life, and his wife did keep the letters when he died. So they weren't all destroyed, but whatever she saved, basically, is what's ended up in the archive. I think it's always interesting when somebody dies and says, destroy all my manuscripts. Because people want to honour the wishes of the dead, but at the same time, you think, there's whole books here. And I think there were 2 books that were published posthumously of Wyndham's. And, we wouldn't have those if his wishes had been fully adhered to.
Yeah. Although it sounds like he was a very private person.
According to Amy Binns' book, yes, he was. In particular, she describes him as living a very compartmentalised life, so that his science fiction friends, because he did meet with other science fiction authors, they didn't know much about his private life. His family didn't know much about his science fiction life, other than the fact that he was a writer. So, yeah, apparently he had a very compartmentalised life. As far as I know, there is just one video recording of him that exists, which is from about 1960, and he comes across as really quite nervous and uncomfortable.
Somebody once said that the heart of fantasy is the willing suspension of disbelief. Well, you must not go beyond a certain barrier, if you can find it, in which that willing suspension is shattered. For instance, your English reader does not care for the idea of spaceships. I don't quite know why he does. Your American reader loves spaceships. Now, in the downward limit, some of the logical outcomes are not acceptable. For instance, in the chrysalids, you see, you have a world that has been devastated by atomic bombs, and there are a lot of mutations resulting. Now, most mutations would naturally be pretty unpleasant, but one doesn't want to follow that along. I mean, it would swamp the whole story. So that one minimizes, one leaves out the most unpleasant ones. For instance, there was, in the original, a point where a man had, his hat was knocked off, and he was seen to have a third eye in the top of his head. Well, there's no reason why I shouldn't have a third eye, but it just has an unpleasant taste.
May I ask you, Mr. Wyndham, what it is you rely upon for your stimulus? I mean, after all, you're dealing with subjects of fantasy which are outside our own experience. Do you simply brood and think of more and more evil?
Well, I wouldn't say they're all evil. You know, the Midwich Cuckoos children look very evil in the film, but they aren't so evil in the original story. No, sometimes one gets an idea thrown at one. The original Triffids one, I think, came one night when I was walking along a dark lane in the country, and the hedges were only just distinguishable against the sky, and the higher things sticking up from the hedges became rather menacing. One felt that they might come over and strike down, or if they had stings, sting at one. So that the whole thing eventually grew out of that.
Are you ever appalled by the fruits of your imagination?
I don't think I'm appalled. Once when I was younger, before the war, when I was trying to write ghost stories, I used to frighten myself pallid.
Yes, but you got over that now.
Oh, yes. Well, these aren't frightening, I don't think. No.
Triffids we've discussed on previous episodes. Have you ever read his next novel, which is The Kraken Wakes?
No, I haven't.
I read this one just recently, and it does read like... I don't know whether I should say this, but it reads like an author's attempt to recapture what he had with his previous book. It reads like an attempt to do another Day of the Triffids, but this time, instead of plants taking over the earth, it's aliens from the deeps. Not as good, I don't think. The basic premise of The Kraken Wakes is we've got a journalist and his wife who happen to be on a cruise ship, and they see some things in the sky, like meteorites or something falling to Earth, landing in the sea. And then a bit later on, creatures start emerging from the deeps and attacking people. So it's basically an alien invasion, but it's aliens who live underwater, and they try to take over the Earth, basically.
So basically Pacific Rim without the mechs.
I suppose so.
Probably nothing like Pacific Rim without the mechs.
That's what it would be like if Hollywood did it.
Yes.
But it's probably better to say that it's more like War of the Worlds. In the Wells novel, these cylinders arrive from space. Nobody knows what they are, why they're here, but all of a sudden we're attacked. In The Kraken Wakes, it takes nearly half the novel for the characters to know for certain what's going on. When they do find out, these creatures that come out of the sea come out in kind of tanks, sort of egg-shaped tanks, and they have long... I can't remember if they're described as tentacles or tendrils or whatever, but they have these kind of squid-like appendages that reach out and grab people and kill them. So it's better than I'm making it sound, I have to say. But if you read it too soon after you've read Day of the Triffids, it does feel like somebody trying to do Triffids again. But it's not all bad. Those two books in a row, I think, very much established this is what John Wyndham does, from the point of view of people in the 50s. Mm-hmm. He writes these books where disaster happens and it comes from space or from the sky. And have you heard of this cosy catastrophe that Wyndham gets landed with?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of science fiction that I think falls into that category.
Oh, yeah. I think it was Brian Aldiss, must have been Billion Year Spree. Brian Aldiss, the historian of science fiction and novelist, described Wyndham's stories as cosy catastrophes, by which he meant that the characters are living very cosy middle-class lives, which are then upended by something coming from outer space or from in the deeps. But I think The Kraken Wakes is possibly the one that caused Aldiss to think that they were cosy catastrophes, because the first half of the novel is about these two middle-class people just swanning about the place, going to different parts of the world before eventually disaster strikes. So it is a very cosy first half of a book before the catastrophe comes. And the catastrophe, when it comes, spoiler alert, is basically the whole of the earth is flooded by the end of the book. And I think that's what just about saves The Kraken Wakes today, is if you read it now, it could read as an allegory for global warming. What about The Chrysalids? Have you read The Chrysalids?
I haven't read The Chrysalids either, but it's also on that list of soon to be, it's on our list to do for adaptation someday.
I think you must read it. I reread it, it was about 2 weeks ago, and I was blown away by it. I think it still holds up remarkably well. It is not a cosy catastrophe. It's one of Wyndham's few novels to be set not in our world. I mean, it's set on Earth, but it's set after a global catastrophe, after a nuclear war, basically. And the premise is in Labrador, which I don't know if I'm right in saying it's part of Canada.
I think you're right. I think it is.
It's certainly up in that part of the world. That's where the story is set, where we have some mutants who are outcasts and they're sent to the fringes, and then you have the, in air quotes, normal people who occupy the towns, what remains of the towns. And we have a group of children who gradually discover that they are mutants. And in particular, they discover that they have the power to not only communicate telepathically, but to think together. They're able to link minds. It's a fascinating concept, and it's very well explored in the novel. It reads today like a young adult novel. So if you've read something like The Hunger Games, mm-hmm. It's not a million miles from that. And I think it holds up remarkably well. And it's been adapted for radio multiple times. And there's a really good, I'll say more about this later, but there's a really good dramatisation of it by the BBC. I didn't expect that The Chrysalids would hold up, but when I reread it, I was amazed. I think it's really good. I think it's possibly his best book.
Wow.
People have criticised the ending. I won't give away the ending, but people have criticised the ending as being a deus ex machina, that he plucks this ending out of nowhere, which is not actually true. If you read the novel attentively, the ending does not come out of nowhere. It is actually, the seeds of it are planted quite early in the book.
So you've read more than I have of his books at this point, but there was a pattern that I seem to notice, and that is his endings seem extremely abrupt.
Yeah, I think they are a little, yeah.
And is that something that you think carries through all of his books, or just the 3 that I read?
I think he has a tendency to do that. I think Chrysalids possibly reads a little like that, but I read it and then I listened to a BBC adaptation of it that was very faithful to the book. And so listening to that adaptation very soon after reading the book, I was able to see that it's not as abrupt as it seems. But I think Triffids ends a bit abruptly. I think The Kraken Wakes is a little bit abrupt. And one we haven't talked about yet, Trouble with Lichen or Lichen, that feels like a first draft to me. So yeah, that feels a bit abrupt. But always there's something at the beginning that sets you up. So I suspect that he would run out of steam towards the end of writing a novel and then would rush it, but then he would go back to the beginning and figure, I've got to plant some seeds here so that ending makes sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember how Midwich Cuckoos ends.
Oh, it appears really obvious that the Cuckoos are going to succeed in their ability to survive and perhaps even be a serious threat to the world, because they're aliens that have been raised by humans. And then I wrote down his name so I wouldn't forget it.
Is it
Zellaby?
Zellaby.
Yes. Zellaby says, you know what, we're going to show the kids a movie because they'll trust me and help me load this heavy stuff into my car. And he goes up and they're expecting him because they know that he's coming so they can read his mind, and start showing the movie. And then the entire school with Zellaby and all of the kids blows up.
Yeah.
And then you find a letter from his doctor saying that he only has a few months left to live. And yeah. But again, right, very abrupt.
Yeah.
And Stowaway to Mars ends that way as well. Our people that journey to Mars are on their way back. And then we come out of the narrative into the framing story, which is kind of a history of mankind's first trip to Mars, talking about how most of the people went on a trip to Venus and never came home. And the woman who came back from Venus gave birth to her child, but she died in childbirth, and the child was considered illegitimate. And then it's over, and it's all like wrapped up in 3 paragraphs. That's it. That's the whole thing.
Wow. Yeah, it does sound like he had some trouble with endings then. Maybe that should have been one of his book titles, The Trouble with Endings.
The Trouble with, yeah.
So actually, The Midwich Cuckoos is the next book after in chronology. Yeah, you have the Chrysalids in 55, and then The Midwich Cuckoos in 57. And of course, that was made into a film, and then another film, and then another film, and then a TV series. So that's been very well adapted over the years, and therefore has become a very familiar story. You can sort of conjure up an image to people by describing a place as being like the Stepford Wives. You can conjure up a mental picture of certain types of characters by saying, they're a bit of a Midwich Cuckoo. Certainly here in the UK, I think. Or maybe people know it better as Village of the Damned rather than the Midwich Cuckoos. What do you think of the Midwich Cuckoos? I mean, you've spoken about the ending. What about the rest of the book? I mean, does it draw you in?
It does. You think you start off watching a tragedy where all the women in the village become pregnant at first. And then as the abilities of the Cuckoos begin to become revealed, it's almost more like, how can you be so blind to the danger that you're facing? And maybe the danger that they don't understand the danger they're facing, because we all get to look at it in reverse. For things like Day of the Triffids and Village of the Damned, the Midwich Cuckoos, it's spoiled at a cultural level. So there's not a lot of surprise. It's more like going through the process of learning, what happens and doing the exploring, but knowing the end point's already there.
Yeah. A couple of episodes ago, I think I spoke about the beginning of the Midwich Cuckoos and said that it draws you straight into the story because it's people arriving back at their home and finding they can't get to it because there's a roadblock. Yeah. So immediately, it's like on page 1 of the book, something major has happened, and it's a really intriguing opening to a book. And when they did the TV version of it about 4 years ago, they didn't get that at all. They totally wrecked the beginning. And since then, I've watched the whole of that mini-series, and it's not as bad as I thought it was at first. I think the first episode is pretty poor, but the second episode was really very good. And what's interesting is that the second episode took the opportunity to bring the Midwich Cuckoos up to date. And it occurred to me, as I was watching it, that there are 2 major things that have changed in the world since the Midwich Cuckoos was written in 1957. One is that at the time, abortion was illegal, except for sort of extreme medical conditions. So in the 50s, you had no abortion, and you had a limited understanding of DNA and genetics. And if you're trying to tell the Midwich Cuckoo story today, you really have to recognise that abortion is, in the UK, an option for a woman who doesn't want to have the baby she's carrying. So if you're trying to tell that story today, the obvious question is, why are all of these women choosing to give birth? Why are none of them choosing to have an abortion? I'm not saying that they all would want to have an abortion, but at least some of them would consider it.
Sure.
And this mini-series deals with that, and it deals with it very well indeed. It has loads of the women going to a hospital and having a consultation, and they're given the consent form, and they're all just about to sign the consent form, and they find they cannot do it. There is some sort of mental blockage that is preventing them from doing it. And the scene ends with all these clipboards being dropped on the floor, unsigned, because they are unable to give the consent for the abortion. So the mind control of the Midwich Cuckoos is very much there from episode 2 of the miniseries. And also there's the question of the role of the father. I think in 1957, I don't think you could positively prove who the father of a child was in the way that you can nowadays, with a paternity test. But the miniseries addresses that. And indeed, there are some characters. There's one woman who is pregnant, but she is genuinely pregnant from her husband rather than being impregnated by this alien that's arrived on Earth. So I got renewed respect for that miniseries by watching episode 2 of it, because it tried to bring the story up to date, and it did it in a very engaging manner. But it also forced me to reconsider the Midwich Cuckoos and how stories that are set in the future can easily become outdated because they're overtaken by events. Now, I don't think that's happened with the Midwich Cuckoos. I think it is still a valid story and holds up very well. But I was reminded how much the world has changed in, 50-odd years.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that they modernized it and found out that it would still hold up.
Yeah, I wonder if they found that it would still hold up, or whether they had to find a way of forcing it to hold up. Because sometimes you'd be adapting and you'd say, I can't make this work. We're going to have to force it. We're going to have to force something in there. And it did feel sometimes as if that's what they were trying to do in this miniseries. They were trying to force things in there because they didn't have confidence in the original material.
Well, even when the story starts, it's a little unusual, right? The dome drops, and you're with these 2 point of view characters who are very insistent about trying to get in, even though they shouldn't.
Yeah.
And then that's how they get attached to the military, and then they become, the agents for the military watching what's going on in the village. And
yeah. I've probably said this before, but I really like the way that they discover that it is a dome. It's invisible, you can't see it, but he has this whole thing of people sort of probing it, pushing it with sticks, flying holding a caged bird over where they think the dome might be, and watching to see where it is that the bird falls unconscious, because this is what happens inside the dome. Everything becomes unconscious while the women are being impregnated, and then the dome lifts and everything goes back to normal. But actually finding out that it's dome-shaped, I just found that fascinating. It's really good science fiction.
Yeah. In a movie, because the time is so short, I could see about cutting that detail. But in a miniseries, that's one of the things that kind of, it provides some interest.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not just that people are blocked because it's a cylinder, it's a dome. And so people think, oh, so it must extend underground as well, or have a certain shape, or have a definite center.
Yeah.
We just watched the 2003 adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time. And when they get to the scene where the kids are up at night, James says, boy, I really hope they put in the hot chocolate in the sandwiches. And of course, 30 seconds later, the little boy is making hot chocolate and sandwiches. But it made me think, why was that important to James? And it's because it was a touch point for him, right? The discussions that happen from that point forward are based around sitting around a table and sharing with the family. And yeah. So interestingly, I own 2 copies of this book as different ebooks. Normally, Barnes & Noble, if you buy an ebook, will not let you buy it a second time. It will tell you this is already in your library.
Yeah.
And that's true unless they come from different publishers and have different ISBNs.
Okay.
And so when I went to read it, I did a search for it in my Nook, and it came out with 2 titles. And I'm like, wait a minute, how did this happen? Well, the answer is I must have bought one years and years ago when it was on the cheap aisle where you can buy books for $1.99. But then Rosetta Books will make versions of books that have been adapted and will often contain extra information about them. And so when I saw that, I bought it on the spot. So
okay,
I have 2.
And is there any significant difference between them?
I only had time to read the one.
Okay.
So in the last month, we had the ending of the Science Fiction Film Festival. I have started to read all of the Hugo nominees so that I can do respectable voting. So there's 6 novels there. And then I read 3 John Wyndham novels. I reread A Wrinkle in Time for Take Me to Your Reader. And I'm tired.
So did you get round to the 1960 John Wyndham novel, Trouble with Lichen?
No, I didn't.
Just as an aside, I discovered that I've been pronouncing things wrong. I've always called the Kraken Wakes the Kraken Wakes, but when I listened to 2 different audiobook versions of the Kraken Wakes, the readers call it the Kraken Wakes. What's this? So I looked up the word Kraken, and all the things on the internet that tell you how to pronounce the word Kraken say that it's pronounced Kraken. So I've got and I sound very false saying the Kraken Wakes. It just doesn't sound right to me. But I listened to a really early recording of a reading of the Kraken Wakes from the BBC, and the reader says, the Kraken Wakes. I thought, oh, right, so people did used to say Kraken, but somewhere in the last 50 or 60 years they've switched from saying Kraken to Kraken, and nobody told me. And the same with Lichen. I've always said the trouble with Lichen. And I listened to 2 audiobook recordings, and the readers called it Trouble with Lichen. Nobody told me.
Yeah, I've known about the word, I got to think about this, Kraken, for a long, long time, because I caught a copy of, it's a 1970s movie with Harry Hamlin.
Oh, Clash of the Titans.
Yes. Yeah. And I think they referred to it as Kraken.
Really?
And to my 7-year-old phonic trained mind, Kraken would be long A. And so if I was in the back of my head, it's always Kraken.
Yeah. And poetically, that would be better. The Kraken Wakes. It's more harmonious.
Now, both these books, The Day of the Triffids and The Kraken Wakes, are by one of the country's best-known writers of science fiction, John Wyndham. And today, Mr. John Wyndham's latest book, or yesterday rather, but it's just out, is called Trouble with Lichen.
So tell me about the Lichen.
Well, the Lichen, yeah. Trouble with Lichen is, I think, his worst novel, or at least the worst of the novels published under the name John Wyndham in his lifetime. The premise is that a lichen is discovered which has the ability to give people extra life. So it doesn't make you immortal, but it allows you to live longer by slowing down your metabolism. And there's some quite good explorations of the consequence of this. And he goes into things that you probably wouldn't immediately think of. You know, I've read various stories about people who are able to live longer through various chemical means or biological injections or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it's a familiar science fiction trope. But he has this interesting idea that the metabolism is slowed down, and therefore it would be a very popular thing among people who want to stay looking youthful. But you probably, if you got pregnant, you probably would want to stop taking the treatment for the duration of the pregnancy, because otherwise your 9-month pregnancy might last 18 months or 2.5 years. So, now that has never come up in any of the books I've read that deal with immortality or longer lives. So I think he's doing the good science fictional thing there. But what the story is mostly about, it seems, is a kind of a competition between two scientists. One is an elderly male scientist, the other one is a younger woman scientist. And incidentally, there we've got his feminism coming through again with this very strong female character. He has strong female characters in all of his books, except the stowaway one that you described earlier.
Well, that's pre-World War II.
Yeah, that's true. But this one, Trouble with Lichen, seems to get bogged down, in my mind, with two things. One is a lot of quotations. He will tell you a thing is reported in the Daily Mail newspaper, and then he'll give you the article. I mean, he's made it all up. But essentially, here's how this was reported in the Daily Mail. On the other hand, the Daily Express reported it this way, and then he gives you the story from. And it really feels like it needs the hand of an editor to go in there and say, well, let's cut down some of this because it's getting a bit repetitive. Mm-hmm. It's a similar technique that he had used in the Kraken Wakes, but in the Kraken Wakes, the reports are broadcast reports because the journalist who's the central character is making reports for a radio station. So you get to hear his own reports as well as summaries of what he's reading in the newspapers. But in The Trouble with Lichen, there are far too many of these pseudo quotes from newspapers. And the other thing is that it seems very obsessed with one particular view of living for a long time. He has this idea that some people will want to do it for particular reasons that didn't seem very convincing to me. And to be honest, I can't remember what those reasons were anymore. But that some people wouldn't be interested at all. And this kind of social exploration that he doesn't wash for me. None of it was convincing. So he gets the scientific premise across in a very H.G. Wells kind of a way. But when he starts exploring the social consequence, I didn't believe a word of it. And the ending wasn't too satisfying either for this one. So I don't recommend it at all. I mean, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe other readers will find something of value in there. But it felt very, very dated to me. And it felt derivative of his earlier books. And I was heartily disappointed with it. I really wanted to like it. I also suspect that in parts of this book he's trying to be satirical, but it doesn't come across clearly as satire. So you're reading it and you're thinking, I wonder if he's meaning to be funny at this point. and maybe he is, maybe he's not. I don't have the sensitivity as a reader to be able to discern that. Whereas I think in his earlier books, I was able to see when he was being jocular, I could see it, and when he's being serious, I could see that. But here, I don't know. It feels like a first draft to me.
Wow, that's sad.
It is. That was in 1960, and then there's a 9-year gap till you get to his next true novel. I think there was something published in between times, which was a fix-up. But in terms of something written as a novel, the next one you get is 9 years later, and that's Chucky, which I have not read. Have you read Chucky?
No, I haven't. But it's also adapted.
It is, yes. So that's a big gap in our knowledge there, Colin. We'll have to remedy that one day.
Yeah. Well, I think during that time he got married, and so he may have taken some time off as a writer just to enjoy being married.
I think so. Plus, we shouldn't overlook the fact that he was making a very good income. Mm-hmm. I made a note here. Where's my note? Yeah, again, from Amy Binn's book. By about the mid-60s, so after the trouble with Lichen and before Chucky, he was earning around £8,000 a year from royalties. And in today's money, that's £160,000 a year, which is over $200,000 a year from royalties alone.
Yeah.
So when you get to that stage, do you really need to write another book?
That's pretty livable.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
I can get by on it.
Yeah. So this is the thing. He was a very successful writer. Part of that, of course, comes from films. He was paid very handsomely for the rights to the Midwich Cuckoos. And by the way, he loved the film. He loved the Village of the Damned. He thought it was terrific. He knew that there were changes made, but he approved of the changes because he thought they were very intelligent. But on the other hand, he really didn't like the Day of the Triffids film because he thought it was just poor, and it was.
Yeah.
But he was making very good money from selling the rights to these works, you know, as well as from the royalties from the books themselves directly. And then the feedback effect that people know the film, they go and buy the book. So it becomes a sort of a self-reinforcing cycle of income. He's a bit similar to Bradbury, because Bradbury was also making a ton of money from film rights to his books through the 50s and the 60s and beyond, you know, and Bradbury probably didn't need to actually write anything from about 1965. He could have just lived off his movie income. But, you know, writers are driven often, and they carry on writing because they can't stop themselves.
Well, it's what they like.
Absolutely.
I know there are people that consider their writing a job, I think, and I hope to be corrected here by all of our listeners, that a lot of writers, it's also their passion. They're one of those few lucky people that get to take their passion and make a living off of it.
Yeah. Well, we heard this from Rob Sawyer, didn't we? I mean, he said that it was partly the fact that Canada has a free at the point of use healthcare system. He doesn't have to spend all his money on health insurance like American writers do, and he's able to make a living by writing away like crazy. So what do we think of Wyndham overall, if you were to sum him up?
I really like his later writing. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much of his pulp style writing I would like, but I'm curious to read more of it and see what the trend is. Yeah, like even though I pointed out how the female character in Stowaway to Mars didn't fall into his later writing, she is a fairly strong woman because she stows onto this ship. She refuses the entreaties, perhaps we should say, of one of the crew members, and will not reveal the reason why she came on board or who she is.
Right. Yeah.
So she's not like a fainter or any of the other classic tropes from that time, but there's some also very negative things said about women that then come full circle.
Yeah.
And I'd like to see whether that's something that's carried through all of the earlier books or short stories, or if that was like a one-off.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I haven't read that one, so I'm going to have to go and have a look now, just to see if I can see any hints of the later Wyndham in that earlier story. My own summing up would be to say I think Triffids and the Chrysalids are still very strong books, and I think if I had to write like a top 20 or a top 50 science fiction books to recommend to people, I think both of those would be in there, Triffids and Chrysalids. The other thing that became strikingly obvious to me reading about 4 of his books in quick succession is that the one thing that he seems always to be interested in is evolution, and the idea that we may be at the top of the tree now, but we have no special right to be there. You know, it's an accident of evolutionary history that we are where we are. Mm-hmm. And if our environment changes, the advantages that we currently have over other species could very easily disappear. So it's really at the heart of his writing is this idea of survival of the fittest. And we could be displaced by ambulatory vegetation, which is Triffids, creatures from outer space who prefer to live in the sea, which is the Kraken wakes, and the Midwich Cuckoos. You know, somebody coming in from space. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their motives are, but they're going to take us over and change our evolution. And even the Chrysalids is really an evolutionary battle between the traditional people and these mutated people who have special powers. So he's really writing about evolution. So I think that makes him an important writer, because not many people actually embrace that in science fiction. Wells did, but not many writers following on.
Well, and in Stowaway to Mars, that's an aspect of what happens to the Martians.
Oh, is it? Okay.
The Martian culture begins to fade because of the change in climate, and they create intelligent machines.
Right.
And now the machines have succeeded them. In fact, they even visit the Earth, which is the reason why the lady is on the spaceship. Right.
So thank you, John Wyndham. I really enjoyed rereading the stories and reading some that I hadn't read before. And as I say, I was very pleased that they were short because I don't like long books. And he's very much to the point most of the time.
A lot of these new Hugo nominees, I think the lower end is 350 or 400 pages. They're big reads.
Wow. When did it all change? That's what I want to know. But that's for another day, I think.
Yeah, it's not like they're being paid by the word anymore, but...
Shall we move on to a quiz?
Yeah, do you have a quiz for me?
I do have a quiz, yes.
Oh, good.
Now, this is inspired, in part, by John Wyndham, in a very roundabout way. But I'll try and explain it. When I was doing some reading about Wyndham, I discovered that he was born near to where I currently live, and he died near to where I used to live. He was born in a place called Dorridge, which rhymes with porridge. If ever you're stuck for a rhyme for porridge, you can use the town of Dorridge. And that's about 20 to 30 miles away from where I live. When he died, he was living in a place called Petersfield, which is about 20 to 30 miles from where I was born. So this got me thinking about authors and where they're born and where they die. So the quiz is as follows. I've got 10 authors here, and I want you to tell me which country they were born in and which country they died in. Okay, so for example, if I gave you John Wyndham and I said, John Wyndham, born and died, you would say, born in the UK, died in the UK. Okay?
Okay.
But they're not all that straightforward. But we'll start with a straightforward one.
Okay.
Ray Bradbury. Where was he born? Where did he die? And I just need the country.
Born in the United States, in Wisconsin, and died in the United States.
Somewhere.
I want to say California, but I don't think that's right.
It was California, yeah. He was actually born in Illinois.
Oh, Waukegan. No.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I think your brain went to the W and you went to the state rather than the town. But yes, you're right. USA. Next one, Anne McCaffrey.
Oh, I think she's also born in the United States.
Correct.
I'm going to guess died in the United States.
No. She died in Ireland.
Ireland?
Yes. She moved to the Emerald Isle. Next one. I think you might get this one.
Okay.
Arthur C. Clarke.
He died in Sri Lanka.
Correct.
And I think he was born in the United States.
No, he was born in the UK. He's British.
Okay. I keep hearing recordings of him and I can't pick up a trace of a British accent.
Oh, I see. Yeah, he was born in, I think in Somerset, which is the southwest. And in the southwest of England, people round their R's a bit like Americans. So if you've ever heard him talk about a car, he would call it a car. So to an American ear, he does sound a bit American, but to British people, he sounds a bit like a farmer, because that's how, or a pirate, because that's how farmers and pirates speak.
Arr.
That's it. Next one, Octavia Butler.
Oh, she was born in the United States?
Yep.
And I'm not sure where she died, so I'm going to guess the United States again.
Correct. Yep, that's correct. Next one, Isaac Asimov.
Asimov was born in Russia.
Correct.
But died here in the States.
Correct, yeah.
I only recently learned that, by the way.
Next one is Doris Lessing, who I think won a Nobel Prize for literature and also wrote some science fiction. So Doris Lessing. Don't know if you've even heard of her. She's quite well known here.
Well, if you say she's quite well known there, I'm going to say she was born in the UK.
Nope.
Oh, okay. Rats. And died in Canada.
No, you should have stuck with your gun. She died in the UK. She was born in... actually, I had to double check this one, because if you'd asked me this question, I would have said she was born in Zimbabwe and died in the UK. But apparently she was born in Iran. And then she lived much of her childhood in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it then was. And then she moved to the UK, that's where she died. Another one here, J.G. Ballard.
I know he's adapted several times.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know his nationality.
Interesting.
It's kind of like I could tell you about movies and dates, but I couldn't tell you who the director was.
Right, yeah.
J.G. Ballard. Let's say born in the UK, but died in the United States.
Oh, no. He was born in China and died in the UK. I think he was born in the 1930s. And there was some kind of British colony or outpost in China. And that's where he was born. And I don't know if you've ever seen the film Empire of the Sun.
No.
The Spielberg film. That's based on one of his books, and that's autobiographical. It's about his growing up in China at the beginning of World War II. The next one is Judith Merrill.
I haven't heard of her.
Okay. Let me give you some clues. At one point she was married to Frederick Pohl.
That would mean she's been in... Oh, gosh. Yeah, so perhaps born in the UK?
No, born in the US. If you were to look at authors born in... No, let's try that again. If you were to look at authors from a particular country, and Robert J. Sawyer was on that list of authors from a particular country, you might also find Judith Merrill's name on that same list.
So Canada.
Yeah. Yeah, she moved from the US to Canada. Two more. Rudyard Kipling.
Born in the UK, died in India?
Oh, the other way round. Yeah, he was born in India and died in the UK. So again, British, but born in the days of empire. So born to British parents in India. And the last one I've got some specifics on this one, but we'll just go for the countries to begin with.
Okay.
Ursula Le Guin. Where was she born? Where did she die?
Well, she died here in Oregon, I think, because she was living in Eugene.
Ah, okay.
And born, I really don't know. I had assumed she was born in the United States, but I'm going to guess...
Correct.
Okay.
You are correct, yeah. Yeah, born in the US, died in the US. Yeah, I was going to ask you if you knew specifically where. And according to my notes, she was born in Berkeley, California, and she died in Portland. But you may be right with Eugene, I don't know. Certainly your home state.
Yes. She used to do a blog about her cat.
Ah, okay. I didn't keep score, but
I didn't do very well.
Finally, shall we move on to past, present, and future?
Sure.
What have you got?
In my research, which corresponds to a trip I'll be taking in the near future, I found out that in Day of the Triffids, that John Wyndham included parts of London geography in his book that are very accurate.
Okay.
And in May 2015, in Hampstead, in an alley that was mentioned in his book, there is a memorial to John Wyndham, which is now known, and the alley is now known as Triffid Alley.
Oh, yeah. So you're going to go there, are you?
Yeah. I figured we would go there and take a picture of me next to the plaque.
Brilliant. I've got a Wyndham-related past item, and I mentioned it earlier, and it's the BBC radio dramatisation of the Chrysalids from 1982. It is very faithful to the book. It was written by Barbara Clegg, who was a very prolific TV writer from the 1960s onwards, and she did also write for Doctor Who, so she has some science fiction credibility. It does sound a little bit dated, because, radio drama in 1982 was perhaps a little bit flat compared to today's. And in particular, it has what I would call a BBC trope. In those days, up to the 1980s, probably into the 1990s, if you had a child character in your radio play, you generally wouldn't use a child. You generally would use a grown woman who would put on the voice of a child. And so this dramatisation has a little bit of that in the first 20 minutes, where you've got a sort of a main character who's supposed to be a little boy, but it sounds like a 55-year-old woman.
Oh, wow.
But if you can get over that, it's actually a very good dramatisation, very close to the book. I'm still very impressed by it, even though it's very old now. Not as old as me, though, I hasten to add. Have you got any others?
Not from the past, but I do have a present one.
Okay.
The Locus Awards, the finalists have been announced. Mm-hmm. And that reminds me that usually before the Hugos, we do an episode where we review short stories for the Hugos. So I thought I mentioned the Nebulas are also available.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, the Locusts.
Yes. Is it a vastly different list?
There is some overlap. I didn't check it point by point, but especially in the short stories, there were ones that you'll recognize from the Hugos list.
Yeah. Speaking of Hugos, I've got a strange combo here of past and future. On the 7th of June, 2024, the very first Hugo Award that was ever presented is up for auction. It was given to Forrest J. Ackerman at the 1953 World Science Fiction Convention. And it's up for auction. In the same auction, apparently, is an honorary Hugo that was given to Hugo Gernsback in 1960 as the father of science fiction, because that's why the Hugos are called the Hugos. They're named after Hugo Gernsback. Mm-hmm. So both of these Hugo Awards are up for auction. So if anyone fancies owning a Hugo without having to go to the trouble of writing a novel and getting it voted as the best novel, you can just put in a bid, and who knows, you may win. Have you got any more?
Nope, I'm afraid that taps me out this time.
Well, and the same here. I've run out of stuff as well. So I think it's time to say thanks for listening, folks. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Cuskey. Look for us on Facebook, as I've just spotted a typo in my script. Look for us on Facebook as Siekni Fiction 101. I think that's supposed to say Science Fiction 101. And on our website at 101sf.blogspot.com. Our theme tune is by Purple Planet at purpleplanet.com, and we'll see you next time.